Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast today. We're going to follow a little more streamlined outline for our podcast today. I'm not going to do the intro music or anything, just a little easier on my end to get this podcast out here. Well, welcome to our 45th episode of the Lutheran History Podcast, where we examine various aspects of Lutheran history. Our guest for today is one of our returning guests. It's been a little while, but we're very eager to welcome back Dr. Mark Braun. Now, the topic we're discussing today is on an article that he has appeared in several publications and he's presented on. Is called Black Geneva Piety. We'll get into a little bit of what that actually means, but there's some pretty visual symbolism there and actual history connected with that. This is a topic that hardly a single person who has been a WELS member for 30 years or more can claim that they haven't noticed a shift. At one time, pretty much any WELS pastor you would see in the pulpit was wearing a black preaching robe, commonly called the Geneva. And now today, it would be kind of hard to find one. Everyone seems to be wearing the white alb. So it's a pretty much opposite switch. It's a black and white contrast, quite literally. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Dr. Braun, or Mark, as you've asked me to call you, thank you for joining us today on this topic.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, just a general question to let our audience know. How did you get started on this particular topic and project?
Well, when I was researching for Tale of Two Synods, there was a section of later in the book where I did a survey of a lot of pastors, most of whom have now gone to heaven, who lived during that time period, and said, what did you notice and when did it occur to you that Missouri was changing? And as I expected, I had a broad range of answers, most of which I was expecting that they were going to say. But one individual who had been a rather old professor when I was in school said, we saw that they were becoming much more interested in high liturgical issues, which, as we all know, leads toward doctrinal liberalism or indifferentism. And that prompted a 1993 graduate, his name first, Gerald Chieda, I've only met him once, to write to me and said, I was real surprised to read that. And of course, what he was implying is that being interested in liturgical issues doesn't make you doctrinally suspect. It actually supports a conservative doctrinal view. And it struck me as I read his reply that we've had a real paradigm shift in how we look at the symbolic meaning of wearing a black gown or a white gown or having vestments or chanting, and that what somebody was hearing both on campus from his classmates and from the faculty in the 1990s was very different than they heard in the 40s, 50s, 60s. In fact, I remember a couple of people who left our synod and went to the old ALC, and instantly we also noticed that they were more into, as we would call it, smells and bells, and they would, they were going to a more doctrinally open synod, and the whole thing had switched now. So that led me into finding some things I already had read in Missouri and Wisconsin publications, but then finding a lot of other things. And then, as I did with the Tale of Two Synods, I got survey responses from a wide variety of people who gave me the whole spread of how the issue still looks today.
Yeah, and again, a strength of the research you've done and is seen in this project as well. You were able to look at the written publications that everyone was openly saying, but then you also did the primary research. What do people really think behind the publications too? And that's a wonderful way to do any project like this. So I think you summarized for us briefly what that shift was, kind of almost like a 180 complete night and day difference, at least visibly in worship practices, but also attitudes about some of that seems to have shifted quite a bit as well with that paradigm shift. Before we can really understand the shift, though, I'm big on context, which is of course fitting for anyone who's interested in history. So I'd like to know the background, and it goes extensive or as brief as you'd like, but what's the context of WELS traditions and history? And I guess I'll pick an arbitrary date, pre-TLH, so before 1941. What's the first 80 or 90 years or so of WELS worship look like?
Well, actually, 1941 and TLH is a good sort of marking point because we do see before that time, I think, the attitudes of the WELS regarding worship, which is not set out clearly and completely, but shows up in places here and there. When the seminary was built in 1928 or 29, in the front of the chapel, all there was a book stand to read, a lectern. There was no altar. There was very low church kind of worship there. And that was something which Wisconsin, I think, was characterized by, even though starting in the late 1850s and 1860s, the Wisconsin became more confessionally conservative and connected with Missouri and found that they had doctrinal agreement. The Wisconsin Synod did not follow the Missouri path as far as worship style was concerned. There was always more of an awareness in Missouri of the church year, of hymns that went with this, and on more of the ceremonies. Although I didn't notice that there were too many complaints, at least in public, about that period of time. In general, in the Wisconsin Synod, there were people who felt that Missouri was a little bit too interested in making show, so to speak, and having more drama of things. But then when we were invited, Wisconsin was invited to participate with Missouri in putting together the 1941 hymnal, then there are some statements about it where John Brenner, the soon-to-be Synod president, said, we don't care about all this liturgical directions and a lot of chanting. We go for very plain worship, plainly spoken. And I would say then the sermon was the center of the service, and the liturgy was sort of an add-on. But now in Missouri, beginning already in the 1920s, there was a growing sense that their worship was just sloppy and poorly prepared. In fact, it's really a humorous part of the paper, just to quote some of the things they said about the awful music and, the people being unprepared and the pastors. I mean, it's a comedy of errors in a way. And so this group called the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau in Missouri was an organization that was formed by people concerned about trying to make their church body more attractive to the non-Germanic audience, and part of it was in response to World War I. And so really the impetus to try to make worship done in a more attractive way grew out of that group. So they became concerned about better hymns that had more Lutheran content, improving the order of service, going back to the historical roots, improving organ worship, and then getting some impetus from Catholic and Anglican groups that also were trying to improve the worship style. Now, Wisconsin, especially in the 30s and 40s, looked on that with a pretty high level of skepticism and discomfort. Am I still there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we had one little internet glitch there, but you're still there. So you said
Okay.
WELS looked at those changes with some discomfort was the last we heard here.
Yeah, well, Brenner, when he became president, even told the members of the committee to be careful what they approved and what they liked. And if memory serves me correctly, TLH was not uniformly accepted in the Wisconsin Synod as quickly as they had hoped. But even in there, rubrics, directions for worship than there had been in the Book of Hymns, which had been used in Wisconsin previously. Now, as it turned out, the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau by the 1940s was also moving a part of the Missouri Synod not only to improve their worship practices, but also to establish fellowship with the ALC at the time. And in the minds of Wisconsin people and conservatives in Missouri, the two are becoming connected to each other. And so I think that was the start of some people seeing liturgical interest as a negative, as a marker for other things that they were concerned about.
Because the same people were promoting some serious things that brought up doctrinal concerns as well, basically, right?
Right. And so when the counterforce to the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau was the Confessional Lutheran Publicity Bureau, which was another organization that organized in the Missouri Synod, an independent group, but they were opposed to these changes. And their monthly magazine was a catalog of everything they didn't like or didn't trust about the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau side many kinds of things, including their innovations in worship and including other practices. And Wisconsin found itself more on the confessional Lutheran side. And increasingly, as they got into the 1950s, they saw these changes in worship as Romanist, moving too much toward Rome, and they thought you've got to also become involved in Roman doctrine as well as some of their liturgical forms.
Yeah, so kind of the slippery slope argument gets often applied in a lot of these areas, and definitely here too.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think one question that you had put out in your paper, and you didn't do, let's put it this way, you didn't try to come to a conclusion yourself by doing research. You simply presented different answers to this question. But were Missouri's liturgical developments, were they rooted in Lutheranism? We're just going back to our history, or do they really truly say we could just connect the dots to Roman Catholicism or something else?
Well, even in Missouri, different people who were in favor of the liturgical movement still voiced some cautions. There was a pretty fair and balanced review about 1959 in the Concordia Theological Monthly magazine by someone who said, here are some of the real values of trying to bring about more liturgical, not innovations, because often they would say we're going back to the ancient church. And and those were good, valid points. But there was also concern about that making the church more open to ecumenism and to influences from the Catholic Church. And it seemed as though people from different synods got together for the sake of encouraging each other. And I think this still goes on today, that there are certain societies where liturgy is their main interest. And so you may have ELCA people today of varying stripes, if you will, and some Missourians and even some Wisconsinites who go together and say we all agree on this interest in worship, but they're outside of the boundaries of fellowship, and yet they may have more in common with each other on liturgical issues than they have within their own church body. So it was not that it was all the same voice being spoken in Missouri either. In fact, I would say, as I said with the Tale of Two Synods, it took me a while to figure out that what was really going on was a civil war within Missouri, and then we were drawn into it because we were in the Synodical Conference.
So what was maybe just tell me if I'm getting this right, what was maybe much more nuanced in the Missouri Synod was a little more kind of like almost like a single monolithic approach, though, in Wisconsin. Did you find more uniformity in the Wisconsin Synod, or was there still a strong liturgical movement in those earlier decades of the 20th century?
There were individuals who wore the white gown and chanted and brought into the service other ancient practices here or there, long before Professor Tiefel became the Continental Divide, if you want to call it that. He didn't really like that position being called that, But I mentioned some of them. The part of the article called "The One and the Many." My point is that there were many people. Maybe many is a little too strong, but there were people in various places, including places that we might not think would be liturgical hubs, who always wore the gown and who chanted. And in spite of, you might think, some of their congregations being a little slow to accept it. And Professor Tiefel himself had experiences with this growing up. And when he came to the seminary, he made it acceptable to do that. And then there was a flood of people who came after that, bit by bit, who bought in. I know that Professor Tiefel's own pastor, when he was at seminary, was one of the slowest ones to move from the black robe to the white alb, surprisingly. And so there always were voices of caution: don't go faster than your members are going. As it turned out, I gave this paper at a conference in Michigan in May of 2006. And after that part of it was done, I sent a copy to Professor Tiefel, and he called me one day and talked nonstop for about an hour and gave me everything he thought about it and didn't let me say too much of anything. And then he said, well, that's enough. And then he was uncomfortable being put in that, being kind of ascribed to that position. And yet he is, I think the great divide is the way to call it, because after him it was acceptable. Some people came out of seminary too excited to do liturgical changes that their congregations weren't ready for. And I think one of his most effective pieces of writing, Professor Tiefels, was when he answered the question, "That's too Catholic," which in my generation, anything that you did in the congregation, even beyond worship, if one of your members said, "That's too Catholic," it was dead, because that was a hard challenge to overcome. And Professor Tiefel gave a lot of good answers to that objection. In fact, one of them was, it's not Catholic, it's Christian. It was here, some of these practices were here long before the church was divided that way. And it was a very well-organized and persuasive presentation. That's not to say he won everybody over. And so the very last part of my paper includes some comments from pastors who are about my generation or a little bit older, who have never been won over. They don't like it. They feel that it's showing off. And I there were a couple of people at the conference I presented who felt that way too, and they wanted their voices heard. And I just said, hey, I'm just reporting what I found. And I think and some things have changed since 2006, where there's more acceptance of a lot of liturgical improvements. And there's better contemporary Christian music than there was. And there seems to be more of a truce between churches and pastors. And I think there's also a little bit of niche marketing some places. If there's 5 churches in town, one of them has a contemporary worship, the rest say, well, okay, that's what they want to do. I don't want to go there, I'm going here, which may be the most helpful way to look at that.
Yeah, well, and later on in your, not to jump to the end already, spoiler alert, right? But you said basically once it was realized that, the color that you wear doesn't determine the doctrine that you have in your heart and mind. Once people realized that wasn't the litmus test that was assumed for a while, I think that maybe brought about some acceptance now in the last several decades for what this truly is. And I think both sides, as you laid out in your article, realized this. They just were maybe a little more defensive. They said this is all technically adiaphora. This is all a point of Christian freedom. But even to this day, though, you still see people, they say, well, this is adiaphora, and then they add the word but, right? And then they really try to sell you or convince you that there's still really only one right way to do this. And those voices seem to be kind of at a fever pitch many decades ago. But now those are, in my subjective opinion, those are kind of more the extreme ends now of this adiaphora. But I would say, yeah, it seems like most people are somewhere in the middle on that, with that appropriate flexibility. But let's rewind, if I can use that acronistic term, and go back a little bit. What were some of the reasons, though, why not just WELS people, but why other Lutheran pastors and laity liked the black robe, which I don't like calling it a Geneva, because that kind of is a insulting term, saying you're a Calvinist, right, or a Zwinglian, but automatically it goes both ways. But why do people like wearing black? What was the symbolism there?
Well, there were several reasons given, and I think one of them was practical. They would go way back to the days when circuit riders, when the Reiseprediger and others would be out, and it was pretty dirty life out there riding on those dusty paths, and they could stuff that black robe into a saddlebag and pull it out, and it wouldn't show the dirt as easily. I think there was, whether it was entirely correctly placed humility or not, there was a sense that white was just too much showing off. And I think the first real argument I ever heard in favor of wearing the black robe is that it covers up the person. And, people aren't spending their time saying, wow, he's really getting fat, isn't he? Or can't he ever match his tie to just being covered up? Now, oddly enough, now that we've come this way, some people have come to the conclusion, hey, white can cover us up just as well as black does. And some said, I like white better because it's a joyful color. It's black is sin and white is forgiveness. And oddly enough, I had a black Geneva. Everybody owned a black Geneva coming out of seminary. But then my mother also bought me a white Geneva, which is really an unding. It's not liturgical or classroom, but our pastor had that one of those when I was a kid. And people would say, you look so much cooler, not like trendy, but like not as hot in the day in church with the white robe on. And actually, because of the material, the white robe was much less comfortable to wear because it was really heavy. And I think there was, there's this long history of in Wisconsin of we love Missouri, but we don't want to be them. And so it was a way to stand out. At the end of the article, I cite something that Professor Schutze wrote about shibboleths, which is this little incident that comes up in Judges. And, some of the Ephraimites couldn't pronounce the SH and they got slaughtered for their trouble. But he defined shibboleths as those things which really have no meaning in and of themselves, but they take on a meaning based on context. And you would not have thought that the black robe or the collar was as big a deal as people made of it. And actually, when you look at the history, there's less of a deal there than you realize. I appreciate the history I've learned about the liturgical garb and the collar, but it came to stand for things. And in the end, I think part of the story is that it's a sad example of being judgmental about looking at things which really are indifferent, but ascribing meaning to them that made people suspicious of each other.
Yeah, and you get into that in some detail, and would it care to go in more into that about how are those expectations of we're this, they're that, we're black, they're white. How are those expectations culturally and even officially formed in the synod schools and in the classrooms?
Now, by the time I got to the synod schools, the mid-1960s, this was quite deeply entrenched. By that time, when I was there, of course, I was in the prep school, but I saw college guys who left for Missouri, and it seemed as though, white gowns, investments, and chains, and their looser view of some doctrines seemed to go hand in hand. And that's really, I think, why my generation came to see becoming more liturgical as an indicator or a bellwether, let's say, of becoming more liberal. But Professor Lehman, who was the music guy at Watertown for many years, he said that 1 year, for the first time after he was at Northwestern for several years, he had a quartet of brass accompany A Mighty Fortress on Reformation Day. Now, that would hardly strike us as a provocative liturgical movement today, but he was immediately confronted by the former president of Northwestern saying, "I don't come to church to be entertained." And I think there was this. I remember old pastors. If you would say to one of them, "I enjoyed your sermon," they would jump on that and say, "You're not supposed to enjoy it. Did it do you any good?" There was a kind of gruffness about the parts of the service. You weren't supposed to be having fun there. So when people in my age started bringing guitars into church or wanting to have more contemporary music, this was just against that whole anti-entertainment mood. And then there was, I talk about one of these sections, how this was being shaped already when I was in college. And there was, I mentioned a classmate of mine who would not ordinarily be accustomed to talking about these things, but he called them beribboned dandies. And, they prance around and in their chancel outfits and all this, because he was responding to a group of people that said, we should care more about the liturgy. And my roommate who did that, I keep his name out of there, but he was the quintessential model of somebody who would just say, why do we have to have all this crap in church, And so that did kind of draw sides on the two sides of the student body at that time. And yet there were those who said, well, if we want to bring God our best, are we doing that by being hostile? I think hostile is not too strong a word, certainly suspicious of liturgical innovations. But just how it plays out, I remember maybe I was 2 or 3 years out of school. This was about 1980. I went to assist at a laying on of hands for a missionary, and there were 4 of us that were up there in the front. I was the only guy with a white robe. And one of the men who was a synodical or district official said, I would never trust the theology of any man wearing a white robe. And he smiled, but he wasn't kidding. And I knew it. And so there were these kinds of cultural reasons not to do this.
Yeah, that's hardly a veiled comment there. And you give many examples more like that, where it's just, it was very, very, very blunt. And I want,
when you get survey respondents who want to say something and who are finally retired that they've got nothing to lose, they really give you a lot of information.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was honestly, I've read this article a couple times, and most recently to prepare for this, and those comments still jump out at me. But I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. As a pastor, I hear all kinds of blunt comments too. So people have opinions, and they like to share them, right? But but tying it, but I think that the shocking thing is, it should be recognized in a way as an opinion, but it's being treated as fact. I think that's the part that really makes it shocking to read and see that. Yeah. And going back to some earlier things, I'm a little more comfortable in the 19th century, but I see a very similar pattern play out in different church bodies. It's almost as if each generation has to do this. And I wonder if there's a frontier thesis in here somewhere. As you're saying, the circuit riders, it was more practical. I don't want to say more evangelical, as if to say one side is less gospel focused than the other, but I think that was a theme that was brought up, right? That the simpler the service, the more receptive guests will be to it, I think was another argument that you said. Of course, I've heard counter arguments too, that your worship guests are there just to do worship the way you do it, and the liturgy is easy to follow along with, and eventually, right? So yeah, I think there's some kind of a frontier thesis there for sure. But there's also the historical trend of the primitive movement, right? The more simple it is, the more apostolic, it is. The first century Christians, I think that's an argument that isn't just the last couple of decades. You see guys like Schmucker and probably Kurtz in the General Synod saying pretty much the same thing 100 years before this was playing out in the Wisconsin Synod. So it's interesting to not just notice one group doing this, but there's a historical pattern of this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we would almost the culture was telling us we should pride ourselves on not being too fussy. And I remember going to it's a liturgical store in the Milwaukee area called Gaspard's at the time when it was becoming more and more acceptable to wear the alb and the vestments. And so I was regularly preaching at a church in town. I needed a set of vestments. And the pastor and I went shopping, looking at all these liturgical things, and wouldn't it be cool if we could wear this? And it felt a little unbecoming of us to do that. Like we cared too much about how we looked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something to be said, right? For why are you doing all these things, right? The why is a deeper question.
Yeah, and I think another concern that came up is that we had the fear that the more the pastor would be concerned about liturgical additions and preparing them and having them done well, the more he might give second effort to his sermon. And without being unkind, I would say there have been church services that I went to that I felt that way, that the service was carried more by the hymns and the choir, and the sermon was shorter. It was less textual sometimes. It was almost more like an introduction to the reading rather than really expounding the text. And in that sense, I'm probably kind of old school. Even, I've come back around to it at my age. I don't really care what's going on at church with the choir or all this to a great degree. I want to hear a pastor take apart a text and make that be the center. And when there was the concern that, well, you can't really do both, right? Or you're going to be there for 2.5 hours. I could sympathize with that concern.
Yeah, I can see that too. Yeah, and on this podcast, I try not to get into too many contemporary issues, but it's kind of hard not to, right? Because it's a daily visible thing, or weekly at least, right, in the life of the worship of the church. But it's good that these things are considered, I think, by anyone, whether it's a pastor or a layperson listening. What's the purpose of all of this, right? And I I think that was some of the fundamental questions that had been asked in the past. What's the purpose of all this, and continue that need to be asked, right, by everyone involved, whether you're whatever way you're participating, for sure. Now another thought popped into my head too, going a little out of order, but I wonder too, in your Tale of Two Synods, you kind of painted these two portraits of these two synods, right? And it's fairly true statement to say, as a rule, the Wisconsin Synod was more rural, and Missouri Synod was kind of both rural, but they definitely had the urban setting too. Do you think that had anything to play into this at all, where the rural communities probably the simpler was better, almost as they almost took pride in the simplicity of it all?
I suppose, with the exception of Milwaukee and maybe Minneapolis, I don't think Wisconsin had a strong presence in the cities. Whereas Missouri had many churches in Chicago. They were in Detroit. They had as many churches as we did in Milwaukee. And there was at least some appearances of them on the East Coast too. But I think it goes more to the self-understanding of each synod. You could find different issues in which the same self-understanding come out. I've never known if this was an entirely true story or not, but there were Wisconsin pastors who felt that Missouri pastors paraded their degrees and their advanced learning to the sense that Wisconsin was kind of a bunch of backwoods people. And the story was that Professor Meyer from our seminary gave most of a paper at a mixed pastors conference in Latin. And was he proud by doing that? Was he trying to show them up that we too have our scholars? I don't know. But we used to talk sometimes about how it's not surprising to find the Missouri Synod Church in a given town being at one of the major crossroads of the city, an imposing building. They were members of Missouri churches that were well-to-do business people who had a bigger effect. And where is the Wisconsin Synod Church? Well, you go way down this highway till it's 2 lanes, and you turn off onto a gravel road and go through a forest, and there sits this little church. It is modestly equipped and almost impossible to find. And there was a poor talk sense that Wisconsin people could have of, well, yeah, but it's just about the word then.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's really hard to argue with that too. Yeah. That goes down to the question, why is there pride in that? To the point of, are we giving God our best? So I think it's an ongoing question where there is no cookie cutter application for people where they're at. But I think these are all important things that need to be asked. And, what gives God the most glory, while at the same time, the proclamation of the gospel, right, is the center stage. Yeah. Anything else you wanted to say? This is a free flowing conversation. I think that's always more enjoyable to listen to rather than stilted question answer kind of thing. But anything you want to make as a concluding remark, or anything that you want to say yet before we wrap up our interview today? I guess I'm wondering, is there anything you want to say about the shift anymore, how that took place? Or is there anything that you've noticed now in the almost 20 years it's been since this article was published that you want to add to what you've already written?
Well, I think I would say that the people that come out at the end of the paper who have not been convinced, and all right, I'm wearing a white gown now because that's what we do, but I've never really made myself comfortable with these changes. I remember some of them when I was younger as a pastor, and they were in the prime of their life, and they just did not believe this would ever catch on in the Wisconsin Synod. I can give you a personal story on that. In the Michigan district, there was a fall district-wide teachers conference, which would meet either in my area or the Detroit area or the Saginaw area, and one of the churches would host it. And my church hosted it at the time when the new Missouri Synod hymnal had just come out. And we decided we were going to do the entire evening vesper service with chanting for this audience of teachers. It took some work, and I didn't see anybody leave because of that. And afterwards, a veteran pastor said, Mark, you did a great job with this, but that's never going to fly in our synod. We're never going to tolerate that kind of of chanting in church. He didn't say it, but what he meant was it's too Catholic. I think there is a change which I'm not entirely comfortable with, that it used to be that we didn't want to be Catholic. And as I said, anytime someone said that's too Catholic, it killed it. We've become much more comfortable being kind of Catholic, at least, Catholic, Lutheran Catholic, or whatever sometimes the term is used. And now we abhor evangelicals much more. And frankly, it's a shame, in a way, that we give our church the public name Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, when I consider what evangelicals have done to that name in terms of, their political support and their desire to become bigger and more powerful and all of that. That's a change which is not entirely comfortable for me. But that generation that, as they grew older and saw the church getting more, let's say, white-robed without them, they held on to some of the old arguments that they had always had. Guys who'd spent a lot of time in the mission field, where they were concerned that they would have a tiny little church meeting in a rented building and had to somehow bring their presence into the larger community. They were bothered about looking as though they were too Catholic. And when we talk with Spanish-speaking people, this is still something they say. Why should we leave the Catholic Church and come to you when we see the same kinds of service going on? And I think there are some legitimate concerns that tend to get kind of pushed aside by saying, well, now we've changed, we've come out of that. So the paper doesn't really resolve everything. I think it just says where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the job of the historian, right? To just give a report, really, without necessarily making conclusions or applications. But I think the job is to present the information so others can take it and ask those necessary questions at where they're at. But I think, and somewhere in your article, there's one voice that maybe said there's a narrow Lutheran middle between being too Catholic or too, I think, sectarian Protestant was the term, which I guess you could swap out for evangelical today. We as Lutherans, we do have not just our own biblical heritage of how we apply and hold on to the truths of Scripture, but we also have our own historical worship heritage too, that actually always has been, in some ways, either too Catholic or neither too sectarian, if you know where to look for it. So maybe that's the only conclusion I'll make today, is there keep both extremes in tension and find the proper application for it.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, Mark, Dr. Braun, for your time today. It's been a pleasure. We talked a little bit about some of your upcoming projects you're working on. Do you care to talk about your history book project, which you have
I can say a little bit about it. I can say a little bit about it. In about 2014, a friend of mine asked if I would come and talk about what's happened since 1961, and he sensed in his pastors' conference, and many of the pastors in there who were under 40 who were quite optimistic that these initial conversations between WELS and ELS and Missouri Synod leaders were going to rather quickly produce fruit, and we're all going to get back together again. And so my job was to kind of rain on their parade. And I talked about some of the history that's occurred since then, and then what the status quo is on some of the issues that separated us. And it was not anything I had to dig deep for. I mean, if you read the quarterly and look at, following the news, you would know about these things. And so this same friend asked again if I would come and do this at another conference 5-6 years later. And after that, we talked about does the Synod want to have, or does the publishing house want to have, a volume 2 that we would call After the Split. And there is more and more information that is being written now by historians out of Missouri, out of the ELCA, that an author in Wisconsin could pick through it and put together a narrative that would make sense to people, and in the Wisconsin Synod. And then there could be 3 or 4 additional shorter chapters, and I hope a more optimistic ending, that even if we're not in fellowship with Missouri again, which I don't believe is going to happen so quickly or so easily, that there's a much better relationship outside of fellowship, but in terms of respect and even admiration, that people in the two church bodies have for each other. I mean, the mood at these gatherings when the synod leaders opened it up to pastors from the area, the camaraderie and the getting to know each other, and to see the Missouri and Wisconsin pastor up together, even becoming a little two-man country band up there playing together, playing different instruments and singing. I thought, we haven't seen something like that in at least 80 years. And so if we can't be sisters, can we be helpful cousins? And so, because I think when people come to me and say, I enjoyed A Tale of Two Synods, I would say, really? Because it doesn't have a very happy ending. And maybe this book could have a more hopeful ending, if nothing else.
Yeah, thank you. And there's definitely there's that information gap to be filled, and we're grateful that you're doing it. And yeah, I'm very, very eager to see that whenever it comes out, whenever it's ready. So finally, thank you for your time today, Dr. Braun. It's been a pleasure. Just a brief announcements and housekeeping for us on the podcast today. Next month will be the last podcast of season 3, if you want to call it that way. I've decided I just need to take the summers off to maintain a healthier balance and schedule. And personal news for myself and for my wife, we just announced we accepted our calls to serve at St. Matthew Lutheran Church and their child care center in Marathon, Wisconsin. So we will be leaving the great state of Alaska. We've been saying we say this acceptance with thankful joy. We're thankful for the many years we've had up here. The start of my full-time ministry as a pastor. Two out of 3 of my kids were born here, and for all of them, this is their first memories of home. So it's not easy to leave or say goodbye, but we're also very joyful for the ministry opportunities we will have in St. Matthew's and Marathon. So next month, as the final conclusion episode for the podcast for season 3, we will likely be giving you guys a kind of a special kind of episode rather than an interview. I will give a little narrative history of some of the history of Lutheranism in Alaska, and some things may surprise you. So with that, thank you for listening, and stay in touch with the Lutheran History Podcast.